Late summer 1944, northern France. Allied troops inspecting a shattered battlefield come across an abandoned German Tiger tank. But there is something impossible about this wreck. Punched straight through the center of its thickest frontal steel is a pristine, perfectly round hole. The subsequent report makes an astonishing claim. The fatal strike was fired by an American tank from 2,000 yards away. According to official U.S. ordnance logs, this was a physical impossibility. No American tank gun in the European theater was capable of penetrating a Tiger's front armor at even half that distance. So how did a weapon that supposedly didn't exist execute the impossible shot? The answer points to a closely guarded ordnance project, the experimental T4 high-velocity armor-piercing round, or HVAP. Unlike standard steel ammunition, the T4 was built around a dense, hyper-hard tungsten-carbide core. Fired from a 76mm gun, it was designed to pierce heavy steel like a high-speed needle. Yet in late summer 1944, this munition was supposedly locked away in stateside testing facilities. This brings us to one of the most enduring legends of the armored war. According to the story, a rogue ordnance officer bypassed the rigid military supply chain, smuggling exactly 37 of these classified prototypes directly to the front lines for an unauthorized combat trial. What follows is a tangled web of frantic battlefield reports and wartime rumors. We will track those 37 experimental shells to separate documented reality from frontline mythology. Did a rogue lieutenant actually orchestrate a miraculous 2,000-yard kill against Germany's most feared armor? Or was this entire story a carefully constructed myth, born out of a desperate need to save the shattered morale of American tank crews? To understand why the American armored force was ripe for such a myth, you have to look at the grim reality of the summer of 1944. When Allied forces pushed into the thick hedgerows of Normandy, American tank crews believed they were driving the best all-around fighting vehicle in the world. The M4 Sherman was reliable, highly maneuverable, and available in massive numbers. The U.S. Army Ordnance Department had assured top commanders that the standard 75mm gun was perfectly adequate for the expected opposition. For the heavier threats, the Ordnance Branch was slowly introducing a longer, more powerful 76mm gun, which they promised would easily handle anything the Germans could field. Then came the brutal reality of the European battlefield. The Germans were not just fielding older, thinner-skinned tanks. They had deployed massed formations of Panthers, equipped with highly sloped frontal armor, and they held the line with the terrifyingly thick, heavy steel plates of the Tiger. The first major clashes triggered a shockwave of panic. American tankers would maneuver into ambush positions, line up a perfect shot on a Panther or Tiger at 1,000 yards, fire their standard armor-piercing shells, and watch in horror as the steel projectiles simply shattered or sparked harmlessly off the German armor. Even the highly anticipated 76mm gun, the supposed cure to heavy German armor, was failing. During a frantic series of ballistic tests held in the French town of Isigny in July 1944, top Allied commanders watched as the newer 76mm armor-piercing shells repeatedly bounced off the sloped front of a captured Panther, even at point-blank ranges. The revelation was devastating. Frontline crews felt entirely betrayed by their own military supply chain. They were fighting in machines that quickly earned a reputation as steel coffins, forced to close to suicidal distances, sometimes under 300 yards, or desperately outflank to get a shot at the thinner side armor of the German behemoths. The crisis quickly reached the highest levels of the Allied command. Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower was famously furious when he learned the truth about the Sherman's vulnerabilities. Confronting his ordnance officers, Eisenhower demanded to know why he had been assured his tanks could defeat the Panther, famously stating, "You mean our 76 won't knock these Panthers out? Why is it that I'm always the last to hear about this stuff?" Ordnance told me this 76 would take care of anything the Germans had. Now I find you can't knock out a damn thing with it. The tactical problem came down to basic physics. A standard steel armor-piercing shell relies on its mass to punch through armor. To defeat thicker, hardened steel, you either need a substantially larger, heavier gun, which wouldn't physically fit inside the current Sherman turret, or you need to push a projectile to extreme hypersonic velocities. American engineers knew this, and they actually had a theoretical solution already in development. The concept was a high-velocity armor-piercing round, or HVAP. The engineering behind it was a masterclass in kinetic energy manipulation. Instead of a solid chunk of heavy steel, the HVAP round used a subcaliber core made of tungsten-carbide. Tungsten was one of the densest and hardest metals on Earth, significantly harder than standard German steel armor. To get this dense penetrator up to the necessary speed, engineers wrapped the narrow tungsten core in a lightweight aluminum body and windshield. Because the overall weight of the shell was drastically reduced by the aluminum, the explosive charge in the gun casing could propel it at a terrifying velocity, over 3,400 feet per second. When the round struck a target, the soft aluminum body would crumple away upon impact, while the hyper-hard tungsten core, carrying immense kinetic energy concentrated into a very small point, would punch straight through the thickest armor plate like a high-speed needle driven through heavy leather. On paper, it was the exact silver bullet the armored divisions were begging for. The 76mm HVAP could theoretically pierce a Tiger's frontal armor from 1,000 yards out, transforming the outgunned Shermans back into lethal predators. But there was a catch. In the late summer of 1944, this miraculous ammunition effectively did not exist on the European continent. Tungsten was an incredibly critical and scarce strategic material, desperately needed back home for heavy industrial machine tooling to keep aircraft and munitions factories running. Because of this severe material shortage, mass production of the HVAP rounds was moving at an agonizing crawl. While American tankers were bleeding and dying in the French countryside, losing their faith in their equipment and their command, the experimental rounds were stuck in stateside testing facilities at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. The solution to the greatest crisis facing the American Armored Corps was a closely guarded secret, trapped thousands of miles across the Atlantic. For the crews on the front line, scanning the tree lines for the dreaded silhouette of a tiger, survival meant relying on luck, numbers, and desperate tactics. They had no idea that a technological miracle even existed, leaving them hopelessly outgunned and praying for an advantage that seemed like it would never come. The bureaucratic deadlock trapping the HVAP rounds stateside finally snapped under the immense pressure of the battlefield crisis. Word of the disastrous Isigny tests and the mounting casualties reached ordnance engineers back in the United States, sparking a frantic scramble to bypass standard procedures. The military supply chain was notoriously slow, requiring extensive field trials, official approvals, and massive shipping allocations before new equipment reached combat units. But the situation in France was desperate, and waiting for the official process meant losing more tanks and crews. This is where the lore of the rogue ordnance officer takes root. According to the enduring legend, a mid-ranking ordnance officer, deeply frustrated by the delays and fully aware of the carnage happening in Normandy, took matters into his own hands. Driven by the urgent need to give tankers a fighting chance, he supposedly bypassed the rigid quartermaster system entirely. The story claims he managed to secure a tiny, unauthorized batch of the highly classified T4 experimental rounds directly from the Aberdeen Proving Ground. This wasn't a standard shipment. It was a desperate, clandestine operation. The officer allegedly loaded the heavy crates onto a transport plane, flew them across the Atlantic, and drove them straight to the front lines himself. The legend focuses on a highly specific number, exactly 37 rounds of 76mm HVAP ammunition. This minuscule supply was supposedly distributed to a handful of elite tank destroyer crews operating the fast, lightly armored M18 Hellcats and a select few Sherman commanders. The distribution came with explicit, strict orders. These experimental rounds were not for general combat. They were to be used only as an absolute last resort, specifically reserved for the sudden, terrifying appearance of a German Tiger or a heavily sloped Panther. The tank crews, who had spent the summer watching their standard shells shatter uselessly against German armor, now held an unproven secret weapon capable of traveling over 3,400 feet per second. The psychological shift was immediate. The feeling of helpless vulnerability was suddenly replaced by the dangerous hope that they finally possessed a silver bullet. They carefully stowed the precious tungsten cord rounds, waiting for the inevitable moment when the dreaded silhouette of a heavy German tank would emerge from the tree line, forcing them to test whether this experimental ammunition was a miracle or just another empty promise from the Ordnance Department. To the men tasked with loading the gun in the claustrophobic turrets of American Shermans and M18 Hellcat tank destroyers, the experimental T4 round felt fundamentally different from anything they had handled before. A standard 76mm armor-piercing shell was a heavy, blunt instrument, a solid chunk of steel weighing roughly 15 pounds. The T4, by contrast, was an elegant piece of lethal engineering. Because its hyper-dense tungsten-carbide core was encased in a lightweight aluminum body and windshield, the entire projectile weighed just over 9 pounds. When the loader slammed it into the breech, the physical lightness of the round belied the massive kinetic violence it was about to unleash. It was this drastic reduction in weight that allowed the standard explosive charge in the brass casing to accelerate the projectile to staggering speeds. For the gunner, peering through the telescopic reticle, this extreme velocity fundamentally altered the mechanics of armored combat. Standard tank gunnery in 1944 was a complex mathematical dance. When firing standard steel ammunition at a target 1,000 yards away, the gunner had to elevate the barrel to compensate for gravity, accounting for a pronounced looping ballistic arc. A slight miscalculation in range meant the heavy steel round would bury itself in the dirt short of the target, or whistle harmlessly over the enemy turret. But the T4 changed all the rules. Propelled at over 3,400 feet per second, the tungsten round did not loop. It flew with a terrifyingly flat trajectory. It behaved less like artillery and more like a laser beam. A gunner could simply place the crosshair's center mass on a distant target, pull the trigger, and the round would arrive almost instantly, effectively eliminating the complex guesswork of long-range engagement. However, mathematical perfection in the air meant absolutely nothing if the gun could not be brought to bear in time. The legendary rogue shipment of 37 experimental rounds, when divided among an active armored group, equated to virtually nothing. For the lucky few elite crews, primarily the men operating the fast, thinly armored M18 Hellcats, whose entire survival doctrine relied on shoot-and-scoot tactics, this extreme scarcity created a unique and agonizing battlefield paranoia. They were holding a weapon that could save their lives, but they had no resupply. This led to a drastic, unauthorized shift in standard operating procedure at the platoon level. According to armored doctrine, an American tank or tank destroyer advancing into unknown territory was supposed to keep a high-explosive, or HE, shell loaded in the breech. The logic was sound. The most statistically probable sudden threats were hidden anti-tank guns, dug-in infantry positions, or troops armed with the deadly Panzerfaust shoulder-fired rocket. An HE round was the correct tool for those targets. But the crews holding the experimental tungsten rounds threw the field manual out the commander's hatch. The psychological terror of turning a blind corner in a French village and coming face-to-face with the heavily sloped frontal glacis of a German Panther dictated a new reality. They kept the precious T4 round constantly loaded in the chamber. It became a talisman, a psychological security blanket against the heavy armor they feared most. This unauthorized doctrine, however, created a terrifying tactical dilemma. If a Hellcat crew suddenly took fire from an infantry position or an anti-tank gun in a tree line, they could not simply swap the round in the gun. Extracting a live, unfired shell from a hot breech in the chaotic, deafening panic of a firefight is an incredibly dangerous and time-consuming procedure. Instead, commanders were frequently forced to make a gut-wrenching decision. To engage the immediate infantry threat, the gunner would have to fire the precious, irreplaceable tungsten round into a dirt bank, a brick wall, or an empty field, essentially throwing away their only silver bullet just to clear the tube for a high-explosive shell. Because of this agonizing reality, the few remaining T4 rounds on the line were treated with an almost religious reverence, kept strictly in reserve for the absolute worst-case scenario. When that scenario finally materialized, the results sent shockwaves not just through the American lines, but deep into the German armored corps. To understand the impact of the tungsten round, one must look through the sights of the enemy. By the late summer and autumn of 1944, German Panzer commanders operating Panthers and the legendary Tigers had developed a specific tactical arrogance, a confidence born purely of technical superiority. The heavy German defensive doctrine relied heavily on standoff engagements. A Panther's high-velocity 75mm gun or a Tiger's fearsome 88 could easily destroy an American Sherman from well beyond 1,000 yards. But more crucially, their frontal armor provided a nearly impenetrable shield against return fire at those same distances. When a German tank commander spotted the muzzle flash of an American 76mm gun at 800 or 1,000 yards, the standard reaction was methodical, cold, and entirely devoid of panic. There was no urgent need for evasive maneuvers. The German driver would simply ensure the thick, highly sloped frontal glacis plate was angled directly at the threat. The crew would brace themselves, listen to the dull, heavy clangs of standard American steel armor-piercing rounds shattering harmlessly against their hull, and take their time laying the crosshairs for a fatal, precise return shot. They operated inside an assumed bubble of invulnerability. Then, the tactical geometry of the battlefield violently fractured. Imagine the sudden, catastrophic shock inside the tight, claustrophobic turret of a German Panther holding a defensive line. The crew is confident, facing forward, fully expecting the American rounds to bounce. Then, an M18 Hellcat equipped with one of the rare T4 rounds fires from the distant tree line. This time, there is no metallic clang of shattering steel. The lightweight aluminum body of the HVAP shell hits the sloped frontal armor and instantly vaporizes. But the hyperdense tungsten core, traveling faster than the speed of sound, bites aggressively into the hardened German steel. It does not deflect. It punches straight through the thickest armor on the vehicle with immense kinetic violence. The mechanism of destruction inside the tank was horrifying. When the hyper-hard tungsten pierced the steel, the immense kinetic energy forced the interior of the German armor plating to fragment and blow inward. This created a supersonic, superheated spray of razor-sharp steel shrapnel, a deadly effect known as spalling, ricocheting violently through the confined crew compartment. The sudden catastrophic destruction of heavy German vehicles that were previously considered completely immune to frontal fire triggered intense alarm within the German ranks. Urgent reports filtered back to German high command. The Americans, long dismissed as merely possessing numerical superiority, suddenly possessed a phantom gun capable of reaching out and killing heavy armor frontally at combat ranges. The invulnerability bubble had instantly burst, forcing German commanders to abandon their arrogant standoff tactics and treat every American gun flash as a potential death sentence. Simultaneously, on the Allied side of the line, the aftermath of these isolated engagements generated a completely different kind of shockwave. As the handful of crews who had successfully deployed the tungsten rounds rotated out of the combat zone, their after-action reports were explosive. The Allied radio nets lit up with frantic, ecstatic claims that seemed to defy the grim reality of the previous months. Exhausted tank crews poured into command tents, their hands shaking as they swore to intelligence officers that they had just punched straight through the front plate of a Panther at 800 yards. Days later, another crew would report a clean, one-shot kill on heavily sloped armor at 1,000 yards. The T4 was no longer just an experimental piece of ordnance. ordnance. In the minds of the men on the ground, it was instantly elevated to the status of a mythical weapon, the definitive answer to their prayers. And like all myths, forged in the desperate crucible of war, the legend of the tungsten shell quickly began to outpace reality. In the frantic, chaotic telephone game of wartime intelligence, those original 37 rounds created a massive distortion in perception. Commanders at the division and corps levels, desperate for any shred of good news to feed their battered armored units, eagerly seized upon these reports. They needed a morale boost to prevent their tank crews from feeling like sacrificial lambs. So the capabilities of the HVAP round were enthusiastically amplified as the stories passed up the chain of command. Furthermore, the fog of war deeply corrupted the data. The terrifying German Tiger tank, while actually relatively rare on the Western Front compared to the Panther or the Panzer IV, was the ultimate boogeyman for every American tanker. Consequently, in the chaos of battle, almost every heavy German tank destroyed in the autumn mist was logged and reported as a Tiger. As the legend grew, the ranges of these miraculous kills began to stretch in the retelling. A solid hit at 800 yards was passed up the chain of command as a kill at 1,200 yards. A lucky strike on a slightly angled side plate was recorded as a miraculous frontal penetration. This rapid shift in battlefield dynamics created a dangerous feedback loop of blind optimism. Allied High Command, reading these increasingly inflated after-action reports, began to believe that the armor crisis was entirely solved. The trickle of highly exaggerated combat data flooded back across the Atlantic to the Ordnance Department, culminating in the ultimate, astonishing claim that would spark endless debate. A pristine, perfectly round hole punched cleanly through the thickest frontal steel of an abandoned German Tiger, supposedly fired by an American 76mm gun from an absolutely impossible distance of 2,000 yards. The legend of the tungsten shell had achieved exactly what High Command desperately needed it to do. It gave terrified men the psychological courage to keep driving forward, convincing them they finally possessed a technological miracle that could slay the German giants. But war is ultimately governed by unyielding physics, not morale-boosting miracles, and reports that sound too good to be true usually are. While the frontline crews celebrated their phantom silver bullet, seasoned ordnance engineers looking closely at the mathematics of the 2,000-yard claim recognized a fatal, undeniable flaw. Because in the frantic rush to build the legend, the battlefield reports had entirely ignored the fundamental aerodynamic laws of ballistics and the strict physical limitations of the very weapon they were worshipping. The fundamental flaw of the T4 HVAP lay in its very design. The lightweight aluminum body that allowed the tungsten core to reach supersonic speeds at the muzzle became a massive liability the moment it left the barrel. Because it lacked overall mass, the round could not maintain its momentum over vast distances. As the shell crossed the battlefield, atmospheric drag acted like a parachute. Past 1,000 yards, its velocity bled off at a staggering rate, taking its devastating kinetic energy and pinpoint accuracy with it. By the time an HVAP shell traveled 2,000 yards, well over a mile, it had lost so much speed that it was physically incapable of piercing a Tiger's thick frontal plate. When analysts later combed through the after-action reports of those famous 37 experimental rounds, the legend fractured against hard data. The verified kills did not happen at sniper distances. They were brutal, close-quarter knife fights. The successful penetrations almost exclusively occurred at desperate ranges of under 800 yards. So how did a dead Tiger end up with a pristine hole and a 2,000-yard attribution? The reality was a combination of battlefield confusion and deliberate morale engineering. The target was likely a misidentified Panzer IV, or the strike was a lucky hit on the thinner side armor by a gunner who was much closer than he claimed. It is also highly probable this myth was quietly encouraged by commanders who desperately needed a hero story to keep terrified crews fighting in outgunned tanks. But wars are not won on phantom statistics. The dangerous gap between comforting frontline myths and the unforgiving laws of physics forced the Ordnance Department into a corner. To separate fact from fiction, they needed an undeniable test, one that would finally pit American guns against heavy German armor under strict scientific conditions. That undeniable test materialized in a secured firing range near the French town of Isigny in August 1944. Top Allied brass, including generals who had previously dismissed frontline complaints as mere combat fatigue, gathered to witness the execution of a captured, fully intact German Panther. First, American gunners fired the standard 75 and 76 millimeter armor-piercing rounds. Just as the battered tank crews had warned, the High Command watched in grim silence as round after heavy steel round sparked and ricocheted harmlessly off the Panther's sloped glacis plate. The terrifying reality of the armor gap was no longer a battlefield rumor. It was a documented fact, unfolding right in front of their eyes. Then, the gunners loaded one of the highly classified T4 HVAP prototypes. The crack of the 76 millimeter gun echoed across the proving ground. This time, there was no metallic bounce. The tungsten core punched cleanly through the heavy German steel. When the officers stepped forward to inspect the damage, the penetration was absolute. It was the exact tactical solution the entire Allied armored corps had been begging for. But any sense of triumph in the mud of Isigny evaporated the moment commanders turned to their logistics officers to demand immediate mass production. The victory of the firing test was instantly overshadowed by a devastating reality. The United States simply did not have the resources to equip the Army. The bottleneck wasn't American manufacturing capability, it was global geology. Tungsten was one of the most critical and scarce strategic metals on the planet. Nearly every ounce the Allies could source was already strictly allocated to the home front, desperately required for the heavy industrial machine tools that kept aircraft factories, shipyards, and munitions plants running. Diverting massive quantities of tungsten to manufacture disposable tank shells would fundamentally cripple the broader industrial war effort. The logistics officers delivered a brutal verdict. The HVAP rounds would eventually be authorized for the European theater, but only as a heavily rationed trickle. A Sherman crew might receive 2 or 3 of these rounds a month, if they were lucky. There would be no magic fleet of invincible tanks. The existence of a perfect weapon meant absolutely nothing if it couldn't reach the breach. As the commanders left the testing ground, the grim truth settled over the High Command. The technological miracle was a logistical mirage. Despite proving they possessed a shell that could kill heavy German armor frontally, the vast majority of American tank crews were condemned to return to the exact same desperate, deadly flanking maneuvers they had relied on since Normandy. So we return to that shattered battlefield in northern France, and the haunting image of the abandoned Tiger tank with a perfect, pristine hole punched through its thickest steel. We now know that the official report of a 2,000-yard sniper shot was a physical impossibility, a mathematical ghost born from the fog of war and a desperate chain of command. Yet understanding the grim reality of 1944 reveals exactly why that ghost was so eagerly embraced. The myth of the impossible kill was a psychological necessity. The high-velocity tungsten round was undoubtedly a brilliant technological stopgap, but it was never the true savior of the American armored corps. The dreaded German heavy tanks were not defeated by a handful of hyper-fast experimental projectiles. They were systematically worn down by relentless industrial logistics, coordinated combined arms tactics, and the sheer overwhelming volume of mass-produced medium tanks. However, on the ground, where outgunned crews were forced to push vulnerable machines through the European countryside, victory required more than just artillery support and endless supply lines. It required hope. The heavily rationed trickle of HVAP ammunition provided exactly that. The mere rumor that a single round resting in the ready rack could instantly slay a giant gave terrified men the psychological armor they needed to keep advancing into the line of fire. In the brutal calculus of armored combat, the belief in a silver bullet proved to be just as crucial to an army's survival as the physical weapon itself. The tungsten shell never won the armor war by transforming the M4 Sherman into a legendary long-range sniper. It couldn't magically erase the brutal physics of industrial warfare, nor could it completely neutralize the terrifying lethality of the heavy German panzers. But for the exhausted, terrified crews forced to drive those vulnerable machines back into the crosshairs, it provided just enough hope to hold the line. Ultimately, it proved that sometimes the most powerful and decisive weapon on any battlefield is simply the myth you build around it.